Welcome to the Healers Podcast, where we inspire and guide healers through business expansion. We give voice to incredibly abundant healers to share their stories. We dive into the quantum field to unlock the energies of conscious creation. We also develop digital tools to help you grow, which you can find on healers.com. I'm your host, Yuli, and I'm grateful you chose to join this space. Now let's go deep.
Hello, dear friends. Another very insightful episode of the Healers Podcast, because today we're talking about the podcasts. I'm personally excited to learn from our guest today, and I hope you as well. And joining us today is Chloe, a podcast marketing expert who specializes in health and wellness. With her understanding of the industry and her passion for wellness, Chloe helps holistic healers and leaders and brands cut through the noise and stand out as thought leaders. We're excited to dive into her insights on leveraging podcasts to grow your brand. Welcome, Chloe.
Hi, Yuli. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited for this.
So I love those episodes, as much as I love talking to healers, and I can talk my entire life to our community and everyone has amazing stories to share. But I'm also extremely excited to bring experts like yourself who are helping the healing community thrive. And I think it's just such an important skill to have, especially in these times when we need more of those voices. In the holistic community, ready to step up, overcome whatever blocks you're working with, right? And we're going to talk a little bit about those, but really step it up. We need your voices out, because I'll tell you what happens when we don't have those voices out, and when you are too shy, too self-conscious, too intimidated to put it out there. There's so much other noise that gets that space and gets the attention. So really, I think the goal, I like to set intention for each episode. And for this one, I really would love to set intention to inspire our audience to really open up, share their visions, share their voices, and start speaking out. And we're going to tell you how to do it. And we're going to walk through some of those blocks and give you the tools and tips how to make it easier. I've gone through that process myself, starting this podcast. It wasn't easy, but Chloe really works with some incredible people, and I can't wait to dive into your advice.
Well, first off, I can tell you this was meant to be, because I know you set an intention for your episodes, so I wanted to set my own. And I also chose inspire as my word there. So we're already killing it here. I would like to inspire health and wellness experts to elevate their brand, expand their orbit, and create change, possibly, change anyone's life through podcast interview marketing. And just like you said, it isn't easy per se. It can be, but it can be really scary. The world of podcasts still is a bit of the Wild West. It seems like there's a new podcast every single day and everybody thinks they should have one. And it can be really intimidating if you don't know where to start. But with the right knowledge, the right research, the right audience, and a little bit of strategy, podcast interview marketing can be incredibly effective for your brand. And through cutting not through only the noise of the other voices out there, but even the noise within your own community and how you can establish yourself as that expert and that thought leader. And podcasts really provide a great opportunity to do that.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. It's really amazing, like how many people it reaches and in the entire world and the feedback we get. So, but since you mentioned the noisy space, right? So what can we tell to people that are sitting at home right now and thinking, okay, there's already a million podcasts out there, especially in the wellness space. So many amazing interviewers, amazing speakers already doing it. What do I have to add to the space? Am I just going to be creating more noise? How can I find my niche? Do I just get out there and talk? Do I bring guests? Where do I even start? So what do you advise people knowing this landscape so well? Are there any opportunities or are any frameworks for them to do that research? What could be their niche?
I would definitely look into as much audience research as you can. Exact figures and demographics aren't precisely available to just anybody. You're going to have to do a lot of digging for that. Sometimes you will have to even ask a host if you're particularly interested. but taking a look at things like their social media, if they have newsletters, Substacks, anything like that, that can get you a pretty good insight on the kind of content they're producing. And you can kind of snuff out for yourself if the people consuming that would also be beneficial for you to have. I would also really it's hard to do because you tend to feel confident that you know exactly who your audience is. And it could be kind of scary to go into the more like fringe or niche areas of those. But I really do push anyone to try and expand what they think they could do and what they think they could explain to people, because just because this audience is listening to this podcast, someone in that audience might know someone who doesn't listen to it, but they heard you on there and now they're going to get interested in it too. Your knowledge and your expertise will definitely set you apart. But even more importantly than that, solely your experience. And your experience is something that only you are going to have. Other people aren't going to have that. Two Reiki instructors, you're not going to get the same results out of both of them just because of they're different people. They're doing different things. So you kind of have to try things out. You have to maybe consider even appealing to audiences who you would think are the absolute opposite of what you would speak to initially, because you could turn people. A lot of people like to kind of just listen to stuff they don't agree with just to kind of fuel their own conviction in what they feel. I can say that I listen to things that make me mad sometimes just because I gotta kind of get those gears turning. So there's a lot of benefit in trying new things. And I think if you are concerned with the confidence that it takes to do podcasts and to kind of advocate for yourself in that way, I would say just try it out. I know that's not exactly actionable advice to just do it, but I really think there's a lot to be said about just doing it, because you're going to get better as time goes on. The more you do, the more you're going to find out what works for you and what doesn't. And you really got to put yourself out there. Again, I know that's never the advice anyone wants because it seems too easy, but sometimes things are easy because they're easy. And putting yourself out there is kind of the answer.
No, absolutely. And I can relate to that as well. And I just remember the few first episodes that I recorded, I was probably cringing. Mm-hmm. And I probably don't want to listen to them now, but this is how we grow, and this is how we evolve, and it's a skill. But you also work with great people to help them with interview placements. So maybe
absolutely,
you feel like that's a great, easier maybe entry point into podcasting. Try to get on some of the podcasts, even the smaller ones, as a guest, and kind of practice through that.
Mm-hmm. I also think managing your expectations with what a good audience is really important. Of course, everyone wants to be on Joe Rogan because a million people listen to it, but you really have to kind of consider your intention here, because, I mean, if 40,000 people are in the room that you're speaking in, but 38,000 of them don't care about what you're talking about, you're not really saying anything that matters. Whereas if you were to go on a show with only 2,000 listeners who are all in on what you have to say, then you're providing that value. And if you're a healer, if you're a health and wellness expert, I would hope that value is precisely what you're trying to provide, because you're trying to help people improve their lives, enrich their lives. And if you want to provide that, you're going to have to find the people who actually want to listen to it. And sometimes that means smaller audience. Here we say bigger is not better, better is better. So it's really about the quality of what you're doing and the people you're reaching that is going to make the difference for you.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And any particular niches that you see through working in the space so much that you're like, okay, this is completely untapped. I wish someone created a podcast for that. Not to put you on the spot, but...
No, you're good. I have been particularly interested in beauty industry experts. I do find when what you're trying to sell is a direct product, it can be a little bit harder with podcast interview marketing just because it tends to sound like an ad. And, we hate ads. People will literally pay money to not have to listen to ads. So if you can include that experience, like I said earlier, and include things like creative storytelling or just providing more value than just, please buy this, we want you to buy this, that's really going to make a difference. So beauty industry, even travel and leisure, it's not massive in the podcast world, but I think there are a lot of conversations that we could have there. And I am interested to see how that kind of spans out more. So anything in the culture kind of section, I got my eye on. So if you're listening and you're interested and you're in that sector, please let me know. I would love to help you.
Amazing. And I think the intersection with wellness kind of goes with all of those subjects. And I think what I find interesting, and people kind of create a a crossover, right? When they do, let's think about a travel show that talks about best wellness spots in the world.
Exactly.
Things like that. I think that would be really interesting. And like, that's what I think forms a really great niche audience, right? When you bring sometimes a couple of different subjects, and I'm just throwing it out there. I don't know, a Reiki for nomads, digital nomads, right? If you're a practitioner who wants to travel the world, how do you practice Reiki? And just have somebody. So a lot of just like thinking about different subjects and how you can kind of bridge them together and create your own niche, because obviously just talking about, wellness in general and health, there's just so much in that topic already. So it has to be more specific, correct?
Yeah, I would say so. There's nothing wrong with going into it like more broadly, because again, a big audience isn't a bad thing. Obviously, better is better, but I'm not sitting here saying a big audience is terrible. We all know that's not true. You do kind of have to embrace the niches and the broad at the same time. And it's just, you kind of have to have some creativity about it, because the listeners are out there. And, if you were a Reiki instructor looking to be on podcasts about wellness spots, it's not like there's a podcast out there called Wellness Spots for Reiki instructors. Like, you kind of have to get a little bit more creative to that to see where your content and where the value that you're trying to provide could be provided.
Got it. And for people who would like to become guests on some of those podcasts, let's say someone has like a favorite podcast, they really love the host and they really want to try to get on it. And maybe it's their dream, and maybe it's something attainable. Maybe it's not a huge podcast. Maybe it's something completely attainable. And I feel like with podcasts, sometimes it's the hardest medium to kind of to reach people, because it's distributed on other platforms. Sometimes big podcasts will have their own website or a page where you can find kind of info. How does somebody go about getting booked as a guest for some of those podcasts?
Outreach is your best bet. And if that is if that's daunting, if that's not something you feel that you can do on your own, I would really recommend looking into an agency like Interview Valet, shamelessly saying it there, because we would do all of that legwork for you. And we have, trusted expertise and market research that could really help you through that. But I mean, honestly, if that's not even interesting to you, I'm just going back to what I said earlier, putting yourself out there. Find a way to get in touch with that host. If that doesn't work, what else is that host doing? Who else is that host talking to you? Could you get in touch with them? Could their audience provide something to you? I would also look into communities. I don't have to tell health and wellness practitioners about the benefit of community building. That's kind of the hallmark of this whole industry. So like, there's a lot of power in that. You might know someone who knows something, who subscribes to the Substack and has the information to get with this host, and you can get in there. Ultimately, I would really look at how you're representing yourself. If social media is not something you use, check your website. Would you be proud for that host to see this? If they were to stumble on it on themselves, would you be proud for them to see this? Do you think you represent yourself well? And also consider what you would say, because one, if you're even interested in you're reaching out, I imagine you have the confidence to say what you need to say. But that also tends to be a bit of a roadblock for most people. They don't feel like they could long form talk about what they're trying to talk about in an interview. It could seem really intimidating, but you're an expert for a reason. People pay you for what you do because you know what you're talking about. And that's kind of where imposter syndrome can come in a bit. So I really do think confidence is key there, and just absolute assurity in what you're doing and how you can help people.
Amazing. And since you mentioned presenting yourself to potential podcast hosts, this is what I find agencies like yours do really well. Being on the other side of the game, being a host, I get a lot of pitches, right, for different guests, and it's really helpful when I get all the information. And that usually includes, and just for people who necessarily, don't want to work with an agent or not there yet, right? They just want to do their own outreach. I think there's really something great you can learn from the way agencies pitch, and you can kind of try to do it on your own. And I love just having those kind of informational packets on each potential guest. Just helps me take a quick snapshot and understand, is this right for our audience or not?
Especially, and if you're a host, if you're listening and you're a host, our agency is also beneficial for you. Other agencies would be beneficial to you. Of course, there's room for everybody, because the guest experts that we use here, they're professionally vetted. We know that they're going to reach and match the goals that the host has. And like if their goals and their views are aligned, then we know that that's going to be a really good meeting there. And that's another reason why podcast interview marketing is a really good tool, because it can be a great social networking tool, especially for anyone who's not interested in social media or they're not interested in traditional content, social media marketing. Because the second you book something with a host, that's already a new contact right there. Their entire audience is going to hear what you have to say. So you're opening up to that. If they have any colleagues or old friends or anyone that your information is relevant to, you've already got an in there too. So it's a really good way to do that. Again, I know social media, just from experience with my clients, I know that can be a bit of a contentious subject. A lot of people don't like social media. And I know that in health and wellness, it can seem obsolete. I do urge everyone to maybe try it out. I do think there's a little bit of unavoidability when it comes to our current world in social media. I think you kind of have to assimilate a bit. I'm not saying you have to go full force and become an influencer. You can even do something like a blog or a newsletter. I love long form content. I'm a very big advocate for that. So I know that blogs are not exactly at the forefront of our online media these days, but there's still a lot of benefit to them. And you could even leverage your podcast interviews to beef those up too, because it's just more content for you to use.
Right. And I think something that a lot of people might not realize is when you do this long form content, that you can then utilize it in a shorter format. First of all, there's amazing software these days that does it for you.
Exactly.
I mean, you can use it yourself, you can use an editor, but you can just use a software that cuts it into smaller chunks, more clips, and you can utilize that content. Like one long form episode can give you multiple social media posts that people might be able to digest even better sometimes, because people love, like they would listen to like a 10 to 30 second, important point, versus they might not have time to listen to an entire episode.
Precisely. And that's why, again, I really love long form content, and podcast interview marketing would count as that. Because right now in our cultural entertainment zeitgeist, short form content is kind of everything, between like TikTok and Reels and Shorts, what have you. And, studies would suggest that the average consumer's attention span has gone down quite a bit in the wake of all of that. And it can be tricky, because with short form content being the go-to form of online content now, it's become really accessible for a lot of different people, which isn't inherently a bad thing, but it could be, because what happens is that everyone starts making content about things, whether they know about it or not. I don't have to tell anyone about misinformation on TikTok. We all know about it. And this is also not revelatory, but the average consumer still to this day kind of just wants to be told what to do, especially if we're talking about things like healthcare, where there can be so much information out there. And when it's mostly short form content that they're looking at, they're getting a million different answers and they don't know which way is up. And if there is a longer form, like a podcast, that is something that where they can get actual meaningful information, valuable information. Because part of healthcare too, if we're talking about healthcare, we're talking about health and wellness, we're oftentimes also talking about things like science or spirituality or culture or sociology. It's these very big, broad, expansive subjects that like really can't just be tapped into a 90-second TikTok. So education is also paramount when it comes to health practitioners, because ultimately you would want to educate the people that you're hoping to serve so that they know that they're making the right choice and that they're getting that value that you're claiming to provide. And I think you can't really educate when it's 90 seconds. It's a lot better if it's a 45-minute. And then from that 45-minute interview, just like you said, you can make so much content out of it. That can become a blog post. That can become a TikTok. That can become even just an audiogram or like a little reel. And then that can get listeners interested to hear what you actually have to say in the long form. It's kind of like the difference between starting the conversation and leading the conversation. And you can start the conversation with a short form content, but if you really want to lead it and you really want to like establish yourself as that expert, I think the long form is what's really going to help you there. Because like, why not lead the conversation if they're listening anyway?
That's such a great point. And I love that you said that a lot of the subjects that we talk about, you just can't fit into that
Mm-mm.
second reel. It's absolutely true. And I have to say also, as someone who's gone through this process, it's just so much more, it's so much easier to know that you have, that 40 or 30, 40 minutes to get your point across. It removes a lot of pressure. And of course, you want to be engaging and you want to have a good pace in the conversation, but just knowing that you don't have to like manipulate someone's attention for that short amount of time. Like people give you the space. I think when someone starts listening to a podcast, they automatically get into that space of, okay, I'm ready to receive now for the next, they give it space and time, which is so refreshing these days.
Mm-hmm. I also love it too, because I mean, think about how many times you've watched a celebrity interview, even if it was just like a 20-minute interview, and you felt like you knew them afterwards. And it's because it's a conversation with two people that as the viewer or the listener, psychologically, you feel like you're getting in on, like you have like this special spot. And it's that intimacy that really kind of sets apart interview marketing from other traditional forms of marketing. It's that intimacy, that vulnerability, even that really, like, again, allows you the space to talk about what you have to talk about, to educate the listener, and to not feel like you got to just like hit your little prompt points, like if you were in like a traditional advertisement or something. And again, I keep bringing up the experience, but you can bring that to a long form content, that a long form interview that you wouldn't be able to a short form. And I think that is what really would set you apart from your peers. I like to say peers. I don't love to say competitors. I think there's room for everybody. And I think everyone's audience is out there. Just because you and this person do the same thing does not mean that your audience is going to be the same. It does not mean you have the same content or value or expertise to offer. And the more people hear from you, the more they're going to know that you're the right person they want to be listening to. So the more interviews you're doing, you're just getting more information out there and just establishing yourself better as the expert that you're trying to.
Absolutely. And I feel like people also just resonate with different personalities, different voice even. Like there's some podcasts that I love their content, but it's something about the pronunciation or the accent of the host. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it doesn't resonate with you. So you want kind of the same information, but from a different person. There's just so much room for everyone, and we're all unique, and we all have, like you said, our own experiences. So I love that message. So let's assume that we convinced our audience to give it a shot. That it is, they're willing to try, they're willing to open up and then find their voice. I think the next block that comes up usually is the intimidation by the technology, the marketing of it, the process itself. And it just seems so complicated and so time consuming. And I think a lot of practitioners, they're probably going to say, well, I spend most of my day treating clients. I just don't have time and capacity for this. What do we say to those people?
If you're interested in starting a podcast, I would first, most importantly, let's talk about equipment. I would say get a good webcam, get a professional microphone. That one I especially cannot stress enough. If you're not going to be posting video, the webcam's not as important. I still think you should have it just to clearly see the guest that you're going to be speaking to. It's nicer. But the microphone, personally, I think is non-negotiable. I think you have to have a professional microphone because, I mean, a podcast with bad audio quality, it's hard to listen to. People, that, like you were saying earlier, sometimes the simple pronunciation or the sound of someone's voice could make someone not listen. So if it's bad audio quality, they're probably not going to. And then find out what podcasting platform you're going to use. If you're looking at Apple, mostly Spotify, mostly they're going to post anywhere. If you're trying to do a Spotify exclusive, that's a whole other take. I don't even honestly know how to help you with that. I would look into that. And then if you want to find people for your show, again, I would look into agencies. A lot of agencies can help you do that. And I would just do similarly as guests. I would do a lot of research, see who's out there. I would also recommend kind of, if you do want to have guests on your show, if this is not going to be a podcast where you're just going to be talking to yourself, line up a good number of guests before you start recording, because anytime you're dealing with clients or guests, I don't have to tell you, it could be, people cancel at the last minute all the time. People could be really finicky. People could show up and you don't like that content and maybe you don't even want to post that interview. So I wouldn't announce really anything until you maybe have a few episodes recorded and you have something lined up for more guests to keep coming. because it's going to take you time to kind of discover your flow and determine how you want these people to go. And a lot of people are interviewed differently than other people. One guest could be perfect for you and another guest could be a nightmare and you don't want them back on. And it's going to be that kind of experience that's going to teach you as you go along what you're looking for in the first place.
Absolutely. No, I couldn't agree more. And I think also another advice is maybe starting with your own community.
Absolutely.
Or you kind of go and reach out to agencies, which will have more of like a professional speakers, people that are doing like the podcast circuit, but maybe it will be less intimidating just starting with a friend or someone, a peer that you worked with, and you can have a conversation where you don't have to kind of worry about getting to know them.
For sure.
It might remove some of the pressure. And maybe, like, I know for me, a few of my very first episodes were just with my teachers and people that I admired in the community, which made it easier also to find them and to schedule them. And I knew the content is going to be something our listeners will like. But the format took some time to fine tune. I agree. Like, even I know it's interviews, but I think there's so many different styles of interviewing.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Until you find your groove. And, do you want to have a set of questions prior to? Do you want to have a certain topic? Do you want to have a free-flowing conversation? I mean, there's so many things to kind of like test and try. And I feel like until you actually do that, you don't know what feels right, because it's always often like you feel it in your body, you feel it in your voice.
Exactly. I would also say, I didn't even think about this till right now. A really good way to start a podcast is to listen to podcasts too. And if you're looking for guests, I mean, at the end of every podcast interview that has a guest on, they tell you where to find them. So you already have that information. So if you hear this person on this podcast, there's really nothing stopping you from emailing them and asking if they would like to come on your podcast too. It's more social networking in a way that doesn't have to utilize social media if you don't want it to be. Whether you're guesting or hosting, there's a lot of community out there that you can really break into using this.
Absolutely. And I have to say also, somebody who is concerned about the time that it takes to produce those episodes, right? I think for me, just removing the pressure of the video from it was something that allowed me to do it more efficiently. Because, this is not my full-time job. I wish I could be a podcaster, but
right.
I have a company to run. So really think about what can you fit in your like limited schedule. And also what's the pace, right? Like, so for me, every 2 weeks, an episode, it feels right. It feels something I can fit into my schedule without feeling overwhelmed, because last thing we want it to be is feel like this daunting.
Yeah, like it's a hassle. It shouldn't be. Yeah, it should be an outlet.
Exactly. It should be fun. Anyway, I look at it as my creative outlet to share some thoughts that I don't have a chance to share on social media, to connect with great people. It's been, by the way, one thing we didn't mention, maybe it's like a great networking tool.
Yeah.
It's an amazing way to meet people through podcasts, because instead of, just approaching somebody, let's say you admire, and saying, oh, I would love to have a conversation. Can we get like on Zoom or for a coffee? They might be like too busy for that. But if you're saying I have a podcast, you actually get a lot more chances to connect with that person. And then you spend an hour.
And it's the same conversation you would have had otherwise. Exactly. And that's another thing too. If you're intimidated by the idea of podcast guesting, you have to remember at the end of the day, it is just a conversation between two people. You're probably still going to be sweating when you're doing it and making your notes. And there's a lot to be said about that. But ultimately, it is a conversation between two people. So it should be natural. And again, if you know that you're providing the value, the rest will kind of happen as it happens. I mean, don't get me wrong, you'll still have editing mistakes. Obviously, I had to repeat a question here. You might talk too fast. It might take you a while to find your groove. But the information is in your brain. It's to getting it out there that can be challenging. But if it's just one person you're talking to, that makes it a lot easier, because it's one person you're talking to, but thousands of people are going to hear it. But that way you don't have to stand in front of a room full of 1,000 people if public speaking is not your jam.
Of course. And I think another point that maybe we can touch on, that this content, since you mentioned there'll be thousands of people potentially listening to it, it's amazing how much people listen to like older episodes over time.
Oh, yeah. Evergreen content. That is something we stress a lot too. That's another really huge benefit of podcast interview marketing, is that information, for the most part, it's it's pretty much going to be the information the whole time in lieu of like maybe just some new information coming out. So you can reuse it as many times as you want. You can bring it back up. I don't care if it's been a year. If what you had to say was relevant, people are going to want to listen to it again, as opposed to like a 90-second TikTok where once it's been 2 weeks past, no one's even thinking about that anymore because it was just like a blip in your mind. Whereas this valuable conversation can be brought up so many times. And I will say, honestly, even if we find out like public information that changes what you said the first time, you can still bring that back up because now you can maybe have a redo where you talk about something different, you expand on it. You can have a second interview with a lot of people. Conversations never have to end if we don't want them to. And if you have a great interview, there's no reason you can't keep it going with that person or even with more people. It's just, if you love talking, I don't know why you wouldn't want to do podcasting. You just get to talk about what you love. What more could you want with that, right?
Amazing. So let's talk about the marketing piece for a little bit, because that I feel like another area that people get intimidated. Okay, but now I have to, have this episode. And either if they are producing their own podcast, they are concerned, how do I market this? How do I get audience? Or if they are a guest on a podcast, we want to make sure that they really utilize that episode to like their best advantage and use that in their marketing and getting those new audiences.
Simple as that. Use it as much as possible. If you're on social media, absolutely use it. Make posts, make audiograms, make images, produce clips, find, the most punchy statement that you said during it and make that a tagline for something. You can turn one simple sentence into a whole campaign, even if like you were really determined enough to do it. And then, it's cross promotion too. The host is also going to be promoting this stuff too. So their audience is going to see it. Your audience is going to see it. And then, like you said, it's evergreen content. Just keep doing it. And then no matter what social media platform you choose to use, or if you're not a social media, if you're more of a newsletter kind of a person, you can still use that content in there because you can make a reel out of it. You can include it. Every pitch that you do from now on for yourself can include, check me out, having this conversation with this person. That's the other thing too. If you do more interviews, you're just opening more doors to do more interviews, because if a host sees that you've done it and they have an example of what you've done, maybe they'll want to keep using you. Similarly for hosts, if you're hosting a podcast, just, I have this guest on. Next week, I'm going to have this guest on where we're talking about this. If there is relevant content out there that other people are talking about, tie it back into you talking about it. You can pillage someone else's content to promote yourself. There's no rule that says you can't do that. And I think you should. Absolutely.
Yes, absolutely. And I think the cross promotion is especially, and I think that's one of the advantages of doing interview style podcasts, that you really just like multiply your audience automatically.
Tenfold.
On being on people's podcasts. And many times, like now on Instagram, you have this amazing feature of collaboration, right? So you can collaborators, so suddenly your content is posted on to their entire audience and vice versa.
And that's why I'm saying if social media is not interesting to you, I would urge you to at least look into a LinkedIn. I do think there's a lot of benefits there. But if you're into more traditional forms, this is still really beneficial to you. You can still use it. You can still market it. It's still content. It's not technical content marketing because it's not on social media, but it's content that you can use over and over again.
And I absolutely agree. It's also such a doorway to other opportunities, because whether you are thinking, let's say, to host events or workshops or work with, let's say, companies, right, to bring wellness to their employees, let's say, or you want to develop your own retreat offering, you want to be on a TV show, you want to write a book, like all those things, like people, when they considering you for those opportunities, they want to know who you are. And it's really hard to know, even if you have the most amazing website out there that tells your story, this beautiful imagery. There's nothing like, listening to you, and especially if they can listen and see you, they get a really quick sense of who you are.
Yeah, absolutely. You can really build trust that way. It's that intimacy again. And I mean, like you said, hearing what you have to say is one thing, but if they can actually hear your voice, that psychologically, that makes a huge difference too. Like you said, it really feels like that's how you know them personally. And again, if you have something to say, I think you should say a lot about it. And I think a conversation is a really good way to do that.
Absolutely. And I think since we covered a lot of the process and the different considerations. I also want to say something about saying no to podcasts that you just feel, or even if they have a big audience, let's say, but it's just, you don't feel like it's the right audience for you, or the subject just doesn't resonate with you.
Mm-hmm.
Or if you are a podcast host and someone comes and they really want to be on a podcast, like, you have the right to say no. You don't have to, especially in the beginning. I feel like I remember starting to get first emails of people actually want to be on my podcast. And it was like so surprising. Like, oh my God, of course, like I need to be saying yes to everyone, but just kind of like staying true to your voice and your message and your audience, and knowing like, yes, this person is great, but they might not be best fit for what I'm delivering. And this conversation might end up being like not the most authentic or beneficial to my audience. I think it's also important to kind of like set the boundaries. Like, what are my values? Like, what am I trying to project out there, and kind of sticking to that.
Precisely. That's a really good point. And I think you said a magic word there with authenticity. I think, especially if we're talking about online content, God, it's really hard to find authenticity, isn't it? Everything is very manufactured. And that's honestly another benefit of podcasts, is that you got this whole conversation amongst two people and it is authentic. You can well, it should be authentic. Sometimes you can tell if it's not, if it's like overly rehearsed, or if it's filled with like too much sales pitchy kind of language. You can kind of snuff that out. And to keep that authenticity at the top of what you're trying to do is really important, because that is going to help you with that discernment with what's going to work for you and what's not. I do think you should say yes to a lot of opportunities, but I also think you're grown-ups. You know when something is not going to be good for you, and you should say no. That doesn't mean that there still isn't benefit in that audience. Those people could still learn a lot from you. You may just have to appeal to them a different way. Maybe look into other podcasts those people are listening to and see if that works out for you. I would also recommend, if you are a podcast host and you are not 100% positive if a guest is going to be a good fit for you, but it's not a no off the bat, look into pre-calls. I think pre-calls can be a really good tool for hosts and guests to get a feel for how the conversation is going to go, if it's even going to work out. Because I'll tell you, working at Interview Valet, there have been plenty of times where we have introduced a guest to a host and the host says, I think I want this person on, but I need to know X, Y, and Z. So then they have a 15-minute call to kind of nail down what they're trying to do. And sometimes they come out of it saying, great, this is going to work. And sometimes they come out of it saying, it's not going to work out. But I don't think any of those pre-calls would still be wastes of time, because you're still learning more about the process. You're learning more about your content. The host is learning more. If you are the host, you're learning more about what you want. It's all a learning process. And I think none of it is pointless.
Amazing. Since you mentioned Interview Valet, can you talk a little bit more about your amazing services and how do you work with your clients?
I would love to. Okay, so at Interview Valet, we offer free services to podcast hosts. So anyone, if you're listening and you would like professionally vetted guest suggestions for your show, please reach out to us at interviewvalet.com. There is a form there for hosts if you want to work with us. And if you are a guest, what will happen is you will go through a series of calls with our sales department where they will nail down your targets, your goals, and kind of the early stages of the strategy that we're going to look at for your campaign. Then you will go through onboarding, where we'll do a whole bunch of stuff. It's boring. I'll let you know when you sign up. It's a whole bunch of stuff where we're really trying to get to know you and do as much research as possible so that we're hitting the right targets and looking at the right areas of podcasts for you. And then we do all the work pretty much. You kind of just sit back and you wait for the invitations to come in. We will help you schedule it. We help facilitate absolutely everything. You show up for the interview and let us know how you feel about that. And we offer constant coaching. So we have regular calls with our clients to see what they're doing, how they're feeling. If we need to pivot something, because it's marketing, that has to happen a lot too. If there's any topics we need to change, how we can shake it up if we need to. It's ultimately, we're a great tool. We're a great guide and a right-hand man for whether you're a host or a guest. We're there to help do a lot of the hard work for you.
I love it. That sounds like an incredible service. Thank you so much. And you guys have been also being able to offer some really great guests for this podcast. So I'm kind of a client, I guess.
Absolutely. And, just to let you know, we get great feedback from our clients that have been on your show. So they think very highly of you too.
Oh, thank you. No, I just love that there's services like that. And we don't have to do all the work. And it's pretty amazing. And like I mentioned before, just from my perspective, just getting that one sheet on each guest that has all of their bio, their headshot, their topics that they can talk about. I think that's like the biggest point, because sometimes you see a profile of a person and you're like, okay, they sound great, but how does it fit to my podcast? And I think it's so easy to kind of scan through the topics that you guys put in that one sheet and realize, okay, we can talk about this, this, and that. It immediately gives me an idea for an episode. And that's just been like a great tool. And even if you try to do it for yourself, something to keep in mind as well, if you want to be a guest on a podcast, just suggesting some topics that align, especially if it aligns with my podcast, but sometimes it can be the opposite. I get offer guests that have like nothing to do with the subject, and they send me all these topics that like absolutely not relevant. So it creates more aggravation and waste time. But if it's at least some of those topics like hit the point, it's just super helpful.
And it can be helpful if you're using an agency like that too, because even we could send you a guest and you're looking at it and you're like, what are they thinking? But because we have that kind of expert behind us, if you say, what are you thinking? We could tell you where we see it, because maybe we see something you don't. Maybe even after hearing that, you say, no, this isn't a good fit. But that's at least like we're starting the conversation there, and we're trying to open up the doors for everyone involved.
Amazing. I love it. Well, hopefully we gave people some ideas on whether they decide to just push themselves to approach more interviews and become guests on podcasts and make it part of their marketing and self-promotion routine. I know a lot of people cringe right now when I say self-promotion, but
I know.
Yes, we're overcoming these blocks together. We have to do it. Like we said it early in this episode when we set the tone, that we need to get voices out there. So hopefully now you have a little better idea of what those avenues are and how to approach those people, and that there's agencies as well that can help you in that process. And then ideally also we inspired some people to maybe think about starting their own podcast, because I feel like there's so much untapped opportunity, especially in the holistic healing space.
Absolutely. I hope, like I said, my intention today was to inspire. And if I inspire you to start a podcast, that's great. I know a lot of people think they need one. Not everyone does. But if you have the right value and the right intention and the right microphone, then I think you absolutely should have a podcast, because you're only going to broaden the information for more and more people to hear it. You're going to network for yourself. And if you're curious about podcast guesting, I really think you need to just try it. Like I said, it's ultimately just talking a lot about what you're passionate about. And if you're going to be doing that anyway, you might as well be doing it as a marketing tactic and as a way to network with other people.
Amazing. Chloe, thank you so much for all of your great advice, the great tips, and the inspiration. It's really a pleasure to have someone like yourself who is such a great expert in marketing and promotion and podcasting, and also work with this community and the wellness and holistic community. We need people like you. Help more and more experts.
And we need people like you, dear listeners. If you want to get out there, please look into us. You can find any information about Interview Valet and me at interviewvalet.com/Chloe. That's where you can have all those quick links if you're interested in starting with us as a host or a guest. Please, I urge you, look into us. We have great things for you.
Amazing.
And thank you so much, Yuli.